Play it, and I'll marry you." Victoria Sterling laughed as the waiter stood frozen. The ballroom erupted in mockery, but when his fingers touched those keys, her laughter died, and the truth shattered everything. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom had never witnessed such opulence. Crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes cast dancing light across marble floors so polished they reflected the faces of those who walked upon them, faces that belonged to the wealthiest families in the nation. Tonight was the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, and attendance was limited to those whose net worth exceeded 9 figures. Marcus Rivera moved through the crowd like a ghost. His serving tray balanced perfectly despite the trembling he felt deep in his bones. He had been working this job for exactly 3 months, ever since he'd lost his position at the music conservatory where he'd been a janitor. That job had at least allowed him to listen to the students practice, to lose himself in melodies that reminded him of a life he'd once dreamed of living. "Champagne," a voice dripped with disdain as a hand waved dismissively in his direction. Marcus turned to see a woman in her late 20s, dripping with jewelry that probably cost more than his family had earned in their entire lives. Her smile was the kind that never reached the eyes, the kind that viewed service workers as animate furniture. "Of course, ma'am," Marcus responded quietly, offering a glass from his tray. She took it without acknowledgement, already turning back to her conversation about a recent acquisition of some tech company. Marcus was invisible to her, as he was to everyone in this room. Just another face in an apron, another set of hands to deliver drinks and remove empty plates. "Marcus!" A sharp whisper cut through the ambient classical music flowing from the live orchestra. It was Thomas, the head caterer, a man whose stress lines had stress lines. "Table 17 needs their dessert course, and for heaven's sake, don't make eye contact with Mrs. Sterling." Last week she had someone fired for looking at her impertinently. Marcus nodded, loading his tray with intricate desserts that were more art than food. As he navigated toward table 17, he couldn't help but notice the grand piano sitting center stage, silent and waiting. The orchestra had taken a break, and the magnificent instrument sat there like a sleeping giant, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light. Something twisted in Marcus's chest. He'd given up piano years ago. Had to. When his father died, leaving behind medical bills that devoured everything, there had been no money for lessons, no time for dreams. The conservatory job had been torture and salvation simultaneously, close enough to music to remember what he'd lost, far enough that the wounds stayed fresh. "Everyone! Everyone! Attention, please!" A voice boomed across the ballroom, amplified by the microphone at the small stage. The crowd quieted as Douglas Sterling took the microphone. He was a man in his 60s, built like someone who'd never known a day of physical labor, whose confidence came from generations of inherited wealth rather than earned achievement. "Thank you all for coming to our annual gala. As you know, the Sterling Foundation has contributed over $50 million this year to various causes." He paused for the obligatory applause. "But tonight, I want to introduce you to someone very special. My daughter, Victoria Sterling, has just returned from completing her studies at the Sorbonne, and she has an announcement to make." Victoria Sterling glided onto the stage with the kind of presence that commanded attention. She moved like someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. Marcus recognized her immediately. She was the woman who'd taken the champagne without acknowledgement minutes earlier. "Thank you, Daddy." Victoria's voice was honey-coating steel. "Tonight, I'm thrilled to announce the launch of my new venture, Sterling Arts Initiative. We'll be providing grants to underprivileged youth who show promise in the arts." The applause was enthusiastic. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard about these initiatives before. They sounded beautiful in press releases, helped wealthy people feel philanthropic, and rarely made it past the press conference stage. "Now," Victoria continued, her eyes scanning the room with amusement, "I know what you're all thinking. Victoria, what do you know about the arts?" "Well, I spent 3 years in Paris studying art history and music appreciation. I've learned to recognize true talent when I see it." She walked toward the piano, running her hand along its edge. "This magnificent instrument was played by Rachmaninoff himself once. It's worth more than most of these chandeliers, and I propose a little game." The crowd murmured with interest. Victoria fed off their attention like oxygen. "I want to demonstrate what real artistry looks like versus what most people think is talent. Her smile widened. I'm looking for a volunteer, someone who thinks they can play piano. Several wealthy guests laughed, understanding this was entertainment at someone's expense. Victoria's eyes swept the room deliberately, passing over the guests, until they landed on Marcus, still holding his tray of desserts. You, she pointed directly at him. The waiter. Come here. Marcus felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward him. His heart hammered against his ribs. Ma'am, I'm working. Oh, don't be shy. Victoria's voice dripped with false encouragement. Come on up here. Let's see what you can do. Thomas shot Marcus a look that screamed, Don't make this worse. But Victoria was already gesturing imperiously, and the crowd was parting, creating a pathway to the stage. Marcus set down his tray with shaking hands and walked through the gauntlet of judgmental stares. Every step felt like walking to an execution. When he reached the stage, Victoria circled him like a predator. What's your name? She asked, though her tone suggested she didn't actually care. Marcus, ma'am. Marcus, she repeated, turning to address the crowd. Marcus here probably thinks he's quite talented. I bet he's played around on a piano somewhere. Thinks he knows his way around the keys. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus stood silent, humiliation burning through his veins. Tell me, Marcus, do you play piano? Victoria asked. The question hung in the air. Marcus could lie, could say no and escape this nightmare. But something in her smug expression, something in the casual cruelty of turning a human being into entertainment, made him lift his chin. I used to study, he said quietly. Oh, Victoria's eyes lit up with delight. He used to study. Everyone. We have a student. She clapped her hands together mockingly. Well then, this is perfect. Here's my proposition, Marcus. If you can play something, anything that impresses me, I'll personally fund your music education. Full scholarship to any school you want. The crowd murmured with appreciation at her generosity. But, Victoria continued, her smile sharpening, if you fail to impress me, you admit in front of everyone here that you're just another person with delusions of talent, that you're nothing special. Deal? Marcus felt sick. This was a trap. Either way, he'd be humiliated. But he thought of his mother, working 3 jobs, of his younger sister, who'd given up her own dreams to help support the family, of every person who'd ever been made to feel small by someone who'd been born on third base and thought they'd hit a triple. And if I do impress you? Marcus asked, his voice stronger than he felt. Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Darling, that's not going to happen. But fine, if you somehow manage to impress me, she paused dramatically, I'll marry you. How's that? The ballroom erupted in laughter. It was absurd, ridiculous, the kind of thing rich people said when they knew there were no consequences. Victoria Sterling marry a waiter? The very suggestion was comedy. We have a deal, Marcus said. Victoria's smile faltered for just a second, surprised that he'd accepted. Then it returned, even wider. Wonderful. Everyone, witness this moment. Marcus the waiter is about to prove that true artistry belongs to those born to it, not those who dream of it. She gestured toward the piano with exaggerated courtesy. Marcus walked toward the instrument, his legs somehow still functioning, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He sat on the bench, and the moment his fingers touched the keys, everything changed. The crowd was still laughing, still talking among themselves, expecting a train wreck. Victoria stood to the side, arms crossed, waiting for the embarrassment to begin. Marcus closed his eyes. He thought of his father, who'd worked himself to death in a factory but had saved for months to buy Marcus a keyboard when he was 8. Of his first teacher, Mrs. Chen, who'd given him lessons for free because she'd said he had something special. Of every night he'd practiced in secret, even after he'd been forced to stop lessons, using the conservatory's practice rooms when everyone else had gone home. He thought of every moment music had saved him when life tried to break him. And then Marcus began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor filled the ballroom like a thunderclap. It wasn't just technically perfect, it was alive. Each note carried emotion so raw, so real, that conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter froze on lips. Victoria's smug expression began to crack like ice under pressure. Marcus poured everything into those keys, every humiliation, every sacrifice, every dream deferred. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, tender one moment and devastating the next. His fingers moved across the keys with a fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, of natural talent, refined by dedication that most of these wealthy guests could never understand. The ballroom had gone completely silent, except for the piano. Even the servers had stopped moving, transfixed. Douglas Sterling's mouth hung open. Thomas the caterer had tears streaming down his face. And Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her face pale, watching this impossible thing unfold before her eyes. Marcus transitioned seamlessly into Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most technically difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. His hands flew across the keys in cascades of notes that seemed impossible for human fingers to execute. But he wasn't just playing notes, he was telling a story of struggle and survival, of beauty emerging from hardship, of the human spirit refusing to be broken, no matter how many times the world tried to crush it. When the final note resonated through the ballroom, the silence that followed was absolute. It lasted for 3 seconds that felt like eternity. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Then the entire ballroom erupted in applause so thunderous that the chandeliers actually trembled. People were standing, some openly weeping, others staring at Marcus like they'd witnessed something sacred. Marcus slowly opened his eyes and stood from the piano bench. His hands were shaking now for entirely different reasons. He turned to face Victoria Sterling, whose expression had transformed from smug superiority to something that looked almost like terror. "I believe," Marcus said quietly, his voice somehow carrying across the silent ballroom. "We had a deal." The silence that followed Marcus's words was more deafening than the applause had been. Victoria Sterling's face cycled through emotions like a malfunctioning traffic light. Shock, anger, humiliation, and something that might have been fear. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. For perhaps the first time in her privileged life, she had no script, no practiced response. "That was... you can't possibly..." Victoria stammered, her usual poise evaporating like morning mist. "Victoria," Douglas Sterling's voice cut through the tension as he strode toward the stage, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. When he reached his daughter, he didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, with an intensity that made the young man's stomach clench. "What's your full name, son?" Douglas asked. "Marcus Daniel Rivera, sir." Douglas's expression flickered with something Marcus couldn't identify. "Rivera, are you related to Daniel Rivera?" Marcus felt his heart stop. "He was my father, sir. He passed away several years ago." The billionaire's face underwent a transformation that shocked everyone watching. The hard lines of corporate authority softened into something approaching grief. "Daniel Rivera worked in my textile factory for 15 years. He was one of the finest men I ever knew." Victoria looked at her father with confusion. "Daddy, what are you—" "Be quiet," Douglas said sharply, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "Your father saved my life. Did you know that?" Marcus shook his head, stunned. His father had never mentioned anything like this. "There was a fire in the factory. Everyone was evacuating, but I'd gone back for the company records. Stupid, I know. Your father came back into a burning building and pulled me out, refused any reward, any recognition, said he was just doing what any decent person would do." Douglas's voice cracked slightly. "I tried to help your family after his death, tried to find you, but your mother had moved, and the trail went cold." The revelation sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. Victoria looked like she wanted the marble floor to swallow her whole. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus began, but Douglas held up a hand. "That performance we just witnessed, your father told me once that you had a gift for music, that you were going to be something special. Looks like he was right." Douglas turned to his daughter. "Victoria, you made a public declaration, a deal, in front of 300 witnesses. Daddy, I was joking. Obviously I was joking." Victoria's voice had lost its confidence, becoming almost shrill. "You can't possibly expect me to—" "I expect you to honor your word," Douglas said coldly. "The Sterling name means something. Or it used to, before you turned integrity into a punchline for your amusement." "This is insane!" Victoria whirled to face Marcus, her eyes blazing. "You can't actually think I'm going to marry you. This was a joke. Entertainment." "Entertainment," Marcus repeated quietly. The word tasted bitter. "Is that what I was? Is that what all service workers are to you? Just entertainment? Something in his tone made Victoria flinch. For the first time, she seemed to actually see him, not as a prop for her games, but as a human being she'd wounded. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Well, well, if it isn't Marcus Rivera. Everyone turned to see a man in his 40s pushing through the crowd, his face flushed with what looked like suppressed rage. His name tag identified him as Professor Jonathan Whitmore, director of the Rothschild Conservatory of Music. Marcus felt ice flood his veins. Whitmore. Of course. You know this young man? Douglas asked. Know him? Whitmore laughed bitterly. I expelled him from our conservatory program 3 years ago. Well, he wasn't technically a student. He was a janitor who was sneaking into practice rooms and pretending to be something he wasn't. The crowd's murmurs intensified. Marcus saw the narrative shifting in real time, from underdog hero back to pretender who didn't know his place. That's not what happened, Marcus said, his voice tight. Oh? Then tell them what happened. Tell them how you lied about your credentials to get access to our facilities. How you posed as a student to use equipment you had no right to touch. I never lied about being a student, Marcus countered, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I was hired as a janitor. My shift ended at midnight. The practice room sat empty from midnight to 6 a.m. I asked permission from the night supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, to use them during hours when no students needed them. Unauthorized use of conservatory property, Whitmore began. Mrs. Patterson gave me written permission, Marcus interrupted. It's not my fault you fired her when you found out, just to cover up your own negligence in not monitoring your facility. How dare you? Whitmore sputtered. I fired her because she violated protocol. You fired her because she was kind to someone you deemed beneath consideration, Marcus shot back. Because in your world, music isn't for people like me. It's for people who can afford $80,000 a year tuition and family connections. The crowd was utterly silent now, a different kind of tension filling the air. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was real-class warfare playing out on a stage intended for champagne toasts and networking. Marcus, a soft voice came from the crowd. An elderly Asian woman was making her way forward, tears streaming down her face. Marcus's eyes widened in recognition. Mrs. Chen? Eleanor Chen had aged since he'd last seen her, but her eyes still held that same warmth that had made her his favorite teacher when he was young. I told you you had a gift, she said, her voice trembling. I told you the day I had to stop giving you lessons because I couldn't afford to anymore. Do you remember what I said? Marcus's throat tightened. You said talent like mine doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment. And I was right. Mrs. Chen turned to address the crowd. I taught piano for 47 years before I retired. I've taught children of presidents, of celebrities, of millionaires. None of them had even half the natural ability this young man possessed. But when his father died, there was no money for lessons. When I offered to teach him for free, his mother refused, too proud to accept charity when they could barely afford food. She looked directly at Whitmore. And you, Jonathan. You expelled him because he made your students look mediocre in comparison. I heard about it through the music community. Heard how a janitor was playing Rachmaninoff in the practice rooms at 2 a.m., and your advanced students could barely manage Mozart. Whitmore's face had gone purple. This is slander. I will not stand here and... You'll stand there and face the truth. Douglas Sterling's voice cut like a blade. I fund your conservatory with a $20 million annual endowment. Would you like to explain to your board of directors why you expelled someone with this level of talent out of petty jealousy? The threat hung in the air. Whitmore looked like he might explode, but he clamped his mouth shut. Victoria had been silent through this entire exchange, her expression shifting between emotions too quickly to track. Now she spoke, her voice smaller than Marcus had ever heard it. I didn't know about any of this. I just thought... You thought I was nobody, Marcus finished for her. Someone you could use for amusement and discard. Someone whose humiliation would make your friends laugh over cocktails. Yes, Victoria admitted, and the honesty seemed to cost her. I'm sorry. The apology shocked the room. Victoria Sterling didn't apologize. Not to waiters, not to anyone she considered beneath her social station. Sorry doesn't erase what you did, Marcus said. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I lost. Sorry doesn't... You're right, Victoria interrupted. You're absolutely right, but my offer still stands. Full scholarship to any music school in the world, and she took a deep breath. I'll honor my word about the other thing, the marriage proposal. The ballroom erupted in chaos. People were shouting questions, cameras were flashing. Apparently some society reporters had been present. Douglas looked like he might faint. Mrs. Chen was openly weeping. No, Marcus said quietly. The word cut through the noise like a knife. Everyone froze. What? Victoria looked genuinely confused. I don't want your pity scholarship, and I certainly don't want to marry someone who sees me as a mistake to be corrected. Marcus turned to address the entire room. All of you are the same. You think generosity means throwing money at people you've hurt. You think charity erases cruelty. But I don't need your money. I never did. Then what do you want? Douglas asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Marcus looked at the piano, then back at the crowd of people who represented everything he'd been taught to aspire to, and everything he'd learned to despise. I want you to understand something. My father died because he couldn't afford the medication that would have saved him. He had insurance through your factory, Mr. Sterling, but it didn't cover experimental treatments. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes, but my father died because $7,000 was too much. Douglas went pale. I didn't know. No one ever knows, Marcus continued. Because people like my father are invisible to people like you. We're numbers on spreadsheets, efficiency metrics, expendable resources. His voice grew stronger. You want to fund arts programs for underprivileged youth? Start by paying your workers enough that they don't have to choose between their children's education and their electricity bill. He turned to Victoria. And you? You want to be philanthropic? Start by treating people with basic human dignity. The waiters serving you tonight? They have dreams too. Talents too. Stories too. But you'll never know because you've never bothered to see them as human. The silence that followed was crushing. Marcus could see his words landing, could see people shifting uncomfortably in their expensive shoes. I'm done here, Marcus said, moving toward the stage steps. Wait! Victoria's voice stopped him. Please, you're right, about all of it. I've been cruel and thoughtless and… She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I want to do better. Let me do better. Marcus turned back to her. Why? So you can feel better about yourself? No, Victoria said, and something in her eyes looked almost genuine. Because you're right, and I hate that you're right, and I hate that it took public humiliation for me to see it. Character growth through humiliation, Marcus said with bitter irony. Welcome to my world. Before anyone could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number. But when he read the message, his face went white. What is it? Mrs. Chen asked, alarmed by his expression. It's my mother, Marcus whispered. She's in the hospital. Heart attack. The ballroom, the confrontation, the revelations. Everything became background noise. Marcus was already moving toward the exit. Wait, Victoria called after him. Let me help. My family has connections with every hospital in the city. I don't want your help, Marcus shouted back, not caring anymore about decorum or consequences. I want my mother to be okay and your money can't fix everything. He ran through the ballroom doors, leaving behind a room full of people forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. But as Marcus disappeared into the night, he didn't see Victoria.